welcome. And this afternoon, we are going to be talking to Arlen Schumer. He is a illustrator, writer, graphic designer, and comic book historian and lecturer. I found out about him through the Facebook, through the webinars that he's presenting for the New York Adventure Club. And it was first off, the topics, were the Silver Age, and then he has one coming up about the Max Fleischer Superman, and those kind of really are in my wheelhouse. So I contacted them, and they were nice enough to hook me up with him, and he's here to talk to us about, his what he has done and what he is doing with his shows. How's it going, Arlen?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Chad. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk.
And God bless Mark Zuckerberg, for all of his other faults, the fact that he created this medium that, how else would we have met, and it's nice to know that, sometimes those online ads, even though we're, buffeted with them all day long, it's nice to know that a good message can get through and hook us up where we ordinarily would never have, met. That is the upside of the whole social media internet world,
Very true. So before we get started talking about, the series you do for the Adventure Club and, anything else, I'd like to, find out just how, my guests got into the comic book hobby, or if they remember the first one, and, if, what you've done since then as a creator in the industry.
Wow. Well, let's see. That's a wide, big question, but my mother was a widow when I was 4 months old. My father passed away, and my mother raised my brother and I, my older brother, by 18 months herself. So very early on, she sent us to summer sleepaway camp for 2 whole months. Now, nowadays, maybe they send the kid away for a month sleepaway, but I was 5 years old, very young, because my mother was under pressure from the relatives. The boys need a father figure. Send them to summer camp so they get the counselors. Well, I didn't find the counselors as the father figures. That's where I discovered comics, because in those days, the bunks were littered with mostly Marvel and DC superhero comics. But there were, I remember, Archie comics, but I remember holding the Superman annual. It was the 25th anniversary. So they had him drawn and colored to look like a silver statue. And it's one of Kurt Swan's greatest Superman, drawings. And he was, the Superman artist of really the baby boom generation. And many comic fans of my era, he was their first favorite artist. But that's the first image of a comic book I can roll. I was 5 years old that summer. And, that's how I started, looking at comics and learning how to read from them before I learned how to read in school. My mother didn't raise us reading Dr. Seuss and children's books. As far back as I can remember, it was always comics. And we started, my brother and I, drawing from the comics, just like every budding artist does that ends up. But, I went through that childhood stage and even into my teenage years where I thought I wanted to be a comic book artist. But then when I got to college, Rhode Island School of Design, I was more intrigued by their graphic design department, because I learned what graphic design was, which was words and pictures, verbal, visual communication. And I'm like, well, that's what comics are, words and pictures. So rather than major in illustration, and they had a great illustration department, I majored in graphic design. And when I got out, I ended up making my living more actually as an illustrator, doing comic book style art, but for advertising and magazines. When you say the industry, if you're referring to the comic book industry, people look at my artwork and think that I've drawn comics for Marvel and DC. I'm an historian of their history, but I've always wanted, the idea of doing 24 pages a month, for me, that would be like a year's worth of work. God bless those guys that can do it. But I'm an illustrator. I like working. I have enough attention span for the single image, and then I got to move on. So I always loved what Roy Lichtenstein did. He brought comic book art into the fine art world, museums and galleries. I wanted to bring comic book art into the commercial art world, where it was never done well. You know, whenever there was a comic book style ad, they were always drawn like crap. They weren't as good as the actual comic book art itself. So that's what I've been trying to do my whole career, as an illustrator, but then as a comic book and pop culture historian, which I just started to do just because I don't know how any artist in any medium cannot be a lover of that medium and not know and want to know its history. I mean, when guys like Bruce Springsteen and Keith Richards, you know, when they play a lick on their guitar, Eric Clapton, any of these geniuses, they know the black blues man that they got that riff from. Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese know the history of film. They can teach it. You know what I'm saying? There are, you know, people like Patti Smith, you know, she was a rock critic before she was a rock critic. So was what's her name from The Pretenders, Chrissy Hynde. You know, a lot of critics become artists or vice versa. And because to me, it's all intertwined. So when I say you know, they call it a self-styled historian or whatever, you know, until you get your higher degree. I eventually got my MFA just a couple of years ago, so I could hopefully one day teach this stuff at a college level. But the webinars I'm doing, the books that I've done, Silver Age of Comic Book Art, that a lot of my lectures are based on. And then, you know, once the shutdown hit, I transferred from live lectures to webinars. But, you know, when things open up again, I hope to get out there and be live. But, you know, if you go to my YouTube channel or my Vimeo channel, you can see videos of my past live lectures, you know, in front of audiences, New York City, at colleges, San Diego Comic-Con. I was a regular lecturer at for years. So hoping to get back in the live lecture scene.
Yep. I think
did that answer your question? Because I had to cover a broad area there.
Well, I also was reading your bio, and I saw that you worked for Neil Adams.
Yes.
I hear he's an up and comer.
For my generation, if you came of age, I was at the right age and the right time because I was exposed to comic book art before Neil Adams by the great DC guys like Kurt Swan, Carmine Infantino, Gil Kane, Murphy Anderson, all the artists that I eventually, you know, put in my book. But I was a DC fan. My brother was the Marvel fan. He liked Jack Kirby. And when I used to look at Marvel comics, they were too busy. There was too many words. Like there was a banal simplicity to the DC comics that appealed to the kid in me. But when Neil Adams hit in the late 60s and early 70s, I was at the right age to have his mind blown by Neil Adams. And anybody in my age range knows exactly what I'm talking about. And you know, Bill Sienkiewicz, if you know his work, Bill Sienkiewicz is maybe one of, the top three of our greatest living comic book art. And he's more than a comic book artist. I mean, he's a full-fledged multimedia maven, if I'm using my Stan Lee alliteration correctly. Multimedia maven. The reason why I bring Bill up is he started out as the ultimate Neil Adams clone. He digested Neil Adams like, you know, like Eric Clapton digested Muddy Waters, or any of these greats digest somebody else's work and make it their own. And that's the impact Neil Adams had. If you had told me when I was 12 years old, at the beginning of the Neil is God, I mean, it was the equivalent of Eric Clapton is God in rock and roll. You know, that's how Neil Adams and Jim Steranko, they were like the twin gods of comic book art during the psychedelic late 60s and into the early 70s, especially Neil Adams in the 70s. Steranko kind of dropped out of comics. He's a whole nother story. But They were the twin gods, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were in rock and roll. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
That's the comic art equivalent. So if you had told a budding, adolescent artist like me, comic book fan, at 12 years old, Arlen, one day you will be working for Neil Adams. One day you will be penciling drawings that he will ink with his. I would have had an adolescent heart attack if you had told me that at 12 years old.
Yeah.
So imagine when I got out of art school and I go to New York City and, through a weird chain of life events, I wind up working for Neil Adams, my childhood idol. I remember for the first couple months, and I was how old? I was 25 years old. It was like going to graduate school, but getting paid for it. Just being next to him, I felt that tingling sensation. You know what I mean? And I'm really blessed to be able to say that I worked for my childhood idol. And I knew instinctively that once I was done working for him, I'd be able to be on my own. Because once you work for your childhood idol, who are you going to work for? You know what I mean? And that's exactly what's happened. In the 2 years I was with him, working in his art studio in New York City, basically 24/7, 365. We never saw the light of day. It was, morning to midnight, doing commercial art, not really comics. At the time I was there, he was mostly doing storyboards, animatic art, comps for advertising, and it paid big money. And but I would say in those 2 years, my drawing improved like 400%. And Neil Adams, he doesn't teach by traditional teaching. He teaches by you observing and through error. Like you bring up a drawing to him in pencil for him to eventually ink. And you knew on that drawing, everything was pretty good, but you knew you screwed up on a little area in there, but you hoped he wouldn't see it. Well, you'd show it to him and like a laser beam, like the Terminator, he would zero in right on the area where you screwed up. So when he didn't say anything, it was a compliment. You learn by a criticism and by exposure and observing. And, so like I said, it was like going to graduate school, getting paid for it, living in New York City and getting your drawing improved by 400%. And I've kept those lessons with me to this day, But yeah, I'm as much of a Neil Adams fan as I am a Bruce Springsteen fan, a fan of the Twilight Zone, all the things that I lecture on and that I've done books on. I consider myself a lover and a scholar of those works. And I've done Neil Adams lectures. He's the title page in my book and the end chapter. I've you know what I mean? I've paid it back, so to speak, by being the best Neil Adams art historian. I did a sketchbook of his incredible sketches. So, since you brought up Neil Adams, that's my Neil Adams story.
Well, so how did you get hooked up with the Adventure Society or the New York City Adventure Society?
It's actually not called that. It's New York Adventure Club. And I only want to say that because their website is very easy to get to because it's just nyadventureclub.com. And you'll see their smorgasbord of events and you'll recognize my graphics whenever I do something for them. But the way that happened was a year ago when the pandemic shutdown hit, New York Adventure Club used to do live, in-person events like walking tours of New York City historical landmarks and things like that. Well, the pandemic shut it down. So overnight, the guy who runs it, named Corey Schneider, nice guy, he had to turn to online webinars overnight. And he needed people who were not only experts in their whatever subject matter, but they had to be visual because you can't just talk. You've got to show images. So he was talking to a friend of mine who is a Frank Sinatra expert non-pareil, and that would be a guy named Will Friedwald, who's written like 10 books on Sinatra. He just did a book on Nat King Cole. Anyway, I met him a few years ago. He came to some of my live presentations in New York City. I went to some of his, and he was put in touch with Corey Schneider about doing probably a webinar about Frank Sinatra, which he's done. And Corey asked him, do you know anybody else that's really expert in their subject matter and is also visual? And he goes, are you kidding me? Talk to Arlen Schumer.
Yeah.
You know, because Will had seen, I did a live presentation on Bruce Springsteen, Steve Ditko, Neil Adams, and he had come to those in New York City. Anyway, and so Corey and I hooked up. I did my first webinar a year ago, April 1st, based on my Silver Age book. And I've been doing them intermittently every couple of weeks ever since. And I also do webinars on my own that are free. The New York Adventure Club are ticketed events, but it's only $10. And I mean, are you kidding me? And so it's been great because for me, the transfer of what I used to do live was very simple, transferring to these webinars, because basically the same images I'm projecting behind me live is what I create just show on the screen. Right. And then I talk like I'm live. So I love perform. It's when you do it live, you're also part performing. So the frustrated actor in me loves the live performance, and I really hope to do more as things open up. Mm-hmm. But I really love doing these webinars because I love my subject matter. I love talking about it. I love showing why it's great. I love telling why it's great. That's really all I'm doing. It's historical. I have an attention to detail. I show you more images in 1 hour than you've ever seen in your life, but you'd never realize how many images you've seen, because unlike most presentations I've seen where you're staring at an image for 15 minutes, I present an image almost like a living comic book with every sentence that I say, and I'm not reading off of notes. It's all in my head. Mm-hmm. So I know my material, so when I talk about it, but I show you an image for practically every sentence or every idea. I show you an image, and I make sure those images also relate to each other. It's like the pages of a book. You're taking people through a verbal visual experience, which is really what I've been doing my whole career, live, in print, and now on these webinars.
I just want to say, I want to thank you for, giving me access to the Silver Age one last week, and for the Superman Fleischer stuff. I was going to purchase a ticket to the Fleischer one after seeing the Silver Age one, but but thank you, and I'll definitely be there this evening. But I do want to say, it was very informative, and I think anybody who's interested could, even if they knew very little about comic books, it's very accessible. What you presented, and I love the songs you were playing. Before the show, the
grace period, as I call it. Yeah. Well, wait till you hear the ones that I play on the Fleischer webinar tonight, the Fleischer Superman webinar. I think they'll really surprise you. But yeah, I always try to have a kind of multimedia opening that has a little music, for the New York Adventure Club, you have to show the technical specs on screen before you start any webinar, so they want music behind the tech specs. So it's a nice opportunity to play DJ and program like 5 minutes of music that has to do with the subject matter of your webinar. So yeah, I have fun with those. And then when I do the webinars on my own, like the one I'm doing Wednesday night, the 26th, I know this is going to drop and people are going to see this days later, and we'll talk about the webinars that are upcoming for the people seeing this when you drop it. But yeah, I mean, the ones I do on my own, I get to do more of a multimedia. The ones I do on my own, I do for free.
Mm-hmm.
But I get to use a platform that really enables me to do more of a multimedia opening than the platform with New York Adventure Club.
Right.
But either way, because listen, I come from a time with slide projectors, you'd be able to do a beautiful soft dissolve to go from image to image. Think of like every Ken Burns documentary you've ever seen. I don't like the hard clunking of images. I prefer the soft dissolves. When I do the platform on my free webinars, I get to do the dissolves and really move the images the way I want to as a graphic designer. The New York Adventure Club platform is more of the just single image, is like a hard cut, which as a graphic designer, I don't like the hard cut. There's a time to do a hard cut if the subject matter calls for it. But I like images dissolving into each other. Like I said, similar to the way Ken Burns does his documentaries.
No, I can completely see that, and I can't wait to see the one on. I believe you said that it was the Ditko and
Romita.
Yeah, Ditko is one of those artists that just blows my mind.
Well, you're not alone. Are you kidding? I mean, Ditko is immortal. He passed away a few years ago, but listen, without Ditko, there'd be no Spider-Man, there'd be no Doctor Strange. And two of the most influential comic book series ever. Spider-Man's costume alone is the greatest costume design in the history of superhero comics. And when you look at, and I make a point to this in my webinar, just the graphics of the mask alone have become the Mickey Mouse ears of Marvel Comics. Just that design that only Ditko could have come up with. What Ditko versus Romita is about is that anybody that knows about the history of Ditko and Spider-Man knows that he left the feature at the early peak of its popularity, before it really became a multimedia phenomenon and the icon it is today. And that's a whole fascinating story in itself. Why Ditko left Marvel Comics at the peak of its popularity, early popularity. You know what I mean? They surged in the later 60s and eventually took over in the 1970s. DC Comics has never, ever, gotten it back. And that was what the whole 60s and the Silver Age were about. But, I digress. What was my original point that you asked me? See, that's what happens. I go off on so many tangents.
That's okay. So do I. So
we need somebody like a script girl keeping continuity. Like, now, what did I say like 5 minutes ago that started me? It's like when you open up too many windows on your computer. You forget what the original window was,
Yeah.
But I know I was making a point about, whatever.
So when you were doing your book about the Silver Age, was there something about that period of the comic industry that you didn't know that you found really fascinating, or what's your favorite, part about the Silver Age? I mean, we kind of talked about the different artists and the creators, but was there anything else, or?
Well, there was a lot. It fills a whole book, I mean, the Silver Age is the 1960s. It's just like the 60s in rock and roll. You've got that explosion of creativity, that explosion of the art form. I mean, in the same way we look back as rock and roll historians as to what the 60s were about. Look, Bob Dylan just celebrated his 80th birthday yesterday. Bob Dylan was the beginning of the creative explosion that became rock and roll as we know it, as an art form. And the same thing happened in comics in the 60s. What used to just be perceived by the general public as a trash, disposable medium that led to juvenile delinquency became the art form that 50 years later has taken over our popular culture. The Marvel movies all come out of the mind, not of Stan Lee, of Jack Kirby, the artist storyteller. I believe Stan Lee was an editor and he wrote the dialogue and the captions, but I don't believe he actually created any of those characters or the stories.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't take away from what he actually did do, which was be a good editor. He wrote snappy dialogue that was very different from what the establishment was doing at DC Comics. And that's what separated Marvel and DC. But you had a guy like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko creating our 20th century modern mythology that, like, oftentimes with things great, like Van Gogh, anyone, it isn't appreciated in its time, even though we, the fans, loved it in its time. But we knew that if Hollywood took superheroes seriously, when I was 10 years old, we used to talk with our comic book buddy. We knew that if Hollywood took superheroes seriously, not campy like the Batman TV show, we hated the Batman TV show. We loved Batman in the comic books, the art of Carmine Infantino, Neil Adams. Some of their greatest artwork was done on Batman. But we hated the campy TV show that made fun of the character. We knew that if Hollywood took superheroes seriously, they would be great films. Well, gee, it only took about 40 years. It's almost like the old generation had to die off that thought comics were junk or could only be done like the Batman TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the guys like Kevin Feige and the people greenlighting all of these superhero and comic book based shows that, like I said, have pretty much taken over our culture. Graphic novels, you know, films, TV shows. If you had told me when I was a kid, that Arlen, one day there will be a superhero themed television show on almost every night of the week, and there'll be a superhero themed movie or a comic book based movie almost every week in the theaters, not including the pandemic shutdown that you'll experience for about a year and a half in the future. But you know what I mean? It's like we dreamed everything that's happened. My brother and I used to sit up in bed at night in our twin beds in our garden apartment in New Jersey. Wouldn't it be incredible if one day there were stores that just sold comics? That was a dream.
Uh-huh.
You know, we didn't grow up with figurines of every character you could think of, and posters and T-shirts and all the stuff, statue. I mean, are you kidding me? But we dreamed about that, and it came true. You know, when I spend my money now on these artist editions where they reproduce the original art, like facsimile reproductions, actual size, of this incredible art from the Silver Age, which during the Silver Age, we would have died for. I mean, are you kidding me? A giant book that looks like the original art to these incredible comics that I'm reading? We would have died. And now that's plentiful. You know, I grew up with reading Peanuts in those little paperback books. Now you get the entire Peanuts run in beautiful hardcovers, incredibly beautifully designed, with introductions written by everybody from Barack Obama to, you know, Jimmy Fallon or whatever. I mean, I'm just telling you, your demographic grew up and has grown up in a literal golden age of comics. You may not realize it, but the wealth of archival reprint material, the incredible range of art and storytelling styles in comics right now, both in mainstream Marvel and DC and in the independents / undergrounds, in the, you know, whatever you want to call everything else, along with the archival reprints. I mean, are you kidding me? Think of Little Nemo in Slumberland, the greatest comic strip ever by Winsor McCay, the guy that invented the animated cartoon. They were printed. I thought I put my ringer off.
That's okay.
You know, my ringer's off and it still rang. It was a spam call. How does that happen? My ringer was off. Anyway,
I thought that was a sound bit you were playing with what you were talking about.
well, I'm glad it came in on cue. I purposely, when I do these things, put my ringer off. I don't know how, and it was a spam call, so maybe they figured out how to beat the mute. Anyway, but you see, it derailed my train of thought. I was driving to a big point at the end that we are living in a true golden age of comic book art. My book is about preserving what led to this golden age. Without the works of Jack Kirby, I just saw on Facebook a promotion for this Eternals movie coming out from Marvel Studios. The Eternals was one of Jack Kirby's later creations that he pretty much tossed off in the later part of his career. And now it's a big budget Marvel movie 50 years later. I'm just saying, this was our dream, and over time, it's actually come true.
Yeah. So are there any, do you currently read comic books, or are there any, obviously Bill Sienkiewicz, but are there any other modern artists that you kind of follow, or?
There's so many, and I hate to bring up a downer, but, one of our greatest illustrators, storytellers, John Paul Leon, just passed away at the age of 49.
Yeah.
And it was also like 5 years ago, I think, that we lost Darwin Cook at the age of 56. And I think 5 years before him, we lost Marshall Rogers, one of our great modern comic artists. So, there are so many great comic artists I can rattle off. I got to think of his name for a second, but the guy works with Neil Gaiman all the time. He did Batwoman.
J.H. Williams.
J.H. Williams the third, right? The third.
Mm-hmm.
One of the greatest comic artists living today is that guy. But I would have put John Paul Leon in that same class. What a distinctive style, and what a loss to the comic art world. But there's female artists. Amy Reeder, who does Rocket Girl, is an incredible artist. I still follow all the independent guys: Dean Haspiel, Charles Burns, Daniel Clowes, Peter Bagg, all the great Chester Brown, all the great Jaime Hernandez, who does Love and Rockets. I've been reading that since issue 1. And he's one of our greatest living cartoonists. Listen, I'm not even into European comics, but there's a whole European thing that it's sort of like foreign films. I respect them. I've seen a few of them, but I'm not a foreign film guy. But there's so many great foreign comics from Europe and Asia and worldwide. Like I said, we are in a creative explosion, really, in a new golden age. And there's just, like I said, there's so many. The average Marvel and DC comic, just for the artwork alone and the printing and the coloring, is at such a sophisticated level. There was this artist, Mitch Gerards, I think is his name.
Gerards.
Well, I don't know if it's Gerards. I don't think there's another R there. I think it's Gerard. I don't think it's Gerard, but the point,
I know you're talking about.
That it did Mr. Miracle, multimedia. Like I said, there's just so many great artists. But like I said, I've actually been spending my money on these like $100 artist editions. And I mean, they just did these giant blow-ups of Ditko's Spider-Man, like bigger than the original art even. They just did and these are like $100 or $125. So that's what I'm spending my hard-earned money on. But again, pre-pandemic, used to go to comic book stores. I would always try to keep up. But I'm telling you, there is a wealth of great stuff out there. Now, story-wise and all that, I'm only really talking about the look of the art. You've got to actually read comics. I mean, to really know whether, is this actually a good story? That's a whole nother subject matter. But what attracts us to even want to page through a comic is the art. The art attracts you to comics. and then you've got to read the story and see whether. Listen, I've read a lot of comics that had great art that I can't remember a single thing about the story. It had no impact, but the art was great. Whereas I can remember great stories I read as a kid that had some of the worst art, some of the artists that I don't like at all. Yet I remember the great story. So in the end, Shakespeare was right. The play is the thing. You know, one of my favorite Batman stories of all time is by the artist Ross Andrew, who, other than when he did Metal Men, I hated his artwork. And yet, my single favorite Batman story from my childhood was illustrated by him. So what does that tell you in the end about the play is the thing? A great story can actually triumph over bad art, but great art cannot triumph a bad story. Meaning, yeah, I appreciate the artwork, but I immediately forget about it because you don't remember the story is what gets into your heart and mind. Where the eyes are satisfied by the artwork because it's beautiful to look at. But comics have to tell a story. You know, they've spoiled me for fine art, most museum and gallery art. It doesn't give me enough content. You see, in comics, it can't just be pretty pictures. You have to tell a story. That's the whole point. And that's both what's simple and very complex about it, is that balance between art and story. But in the end, yeah, what's going to make it memorable is what all those pretty pictures were about.
Mm-hmm. So, I'd like to wrap up now, but I'd love to have you back and we can talk about.
We just scratched the surface. I knew we would only scratch the surface, like the little peak of the iceberg at the very top there.
And I could just sit here all day and just eat all this,
I told you there's no off switch in the once you turn me on. But really, we only did scratch the surface. So
my last question, and then I'll give you a chance to kind of announce, what you have upcoming. But is there a topic that you would really love to do a webinar on, but it's kind of in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I don't know if that would be, appeal to everybody, or that's too complex?
No, it's like anything. There are ideas that are easier than others. I'm doing a couple of upcoming webinars for New York Adventure Club, one on a photographer named Vivian Meyer. And if you don't know her, just do some research into her. I'm proposing that she's the greatest photographer of the 20th century. That's a subject matter. I don't consider myself a photo expert or an historian, but I'm just going to present it from my perspective and, let the, whatever expression I'm searching for, let the things fall where they may, or I don't know what I'm trying to say here. But I'm doing one on the John Brown legend, the steel driving man, which is based on a kind of picture book that I did as part of my MFA thesis. And the story of John Brown is really the archetype, really, for the modern superhero. The image of the strong man in America is really descended from the image of John Henry, a black ex-slave. That was real. It wasn't like Paul Bunyan. He's not a made-up thing. There really was. John Henry is a legend that grew out of a reality about a guy that did die after fighting a steam engine. And that became the legend of John Henry. But it was actually based on a real incident that took place in the late 19th century. So I'm doing a webinar on that for New York Adventure Club. That's in late June. And if you just go to nyadventureclub.com, you'll be able to see what I have upcoming there, because, everybody gets to do a little graphic of their webinar, but trust me, nobody's graphics look like mine, meaning comic book or superhero or pop culture inspired. But yeah, I think June is filled, because this is going to drop at the end of May, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So June, they're going to miss, obviously, tomorrow night I'm doing Ditko Romita. They're not going to see that, but I think
Well,
they'll be.
I'll try to get this up, and I'll include the link, for that. So hopefully, maybe they will.
Right. Well, yeah, because I'll send you the link, but that link might not happen for a week
Yep.
or so later. But people will be able to attend, I think, my June 2nd. This is every Wednesday in June at 6:00 Eastern Standard Time. I'm doing a pop culture / comic book history webinar. June 2nd is the actual anniversary of Will Eisner's The Spirit debuting in 1940 on June 2nd. I'm doing a webinar on The Spirit. If you know nothing about Will Eisner or The Spirit, he was the D.W. Griffith of comics. If you don't know who D.W. Griffith was, well, you got to look that up too. The following Wednesday, the 9th, I'm doing Christ in Comics, the Christological nature of all the superheroes, that they sacrifice themselves to save the people they love or the universe. The week after, the 16th, I'm doing my New York City comics history about how New York City itself has been a creative backdrop for really the history of comics. The very first comic, The Yellow Kid, the turn of the century, was based in New York City. On the 23rd of June, these are all Wednesdays at 6:00, my fourth in my series of James Bond, Sean Connery webinars, the first 4 films, which I consider the canon. And I'm completing that series with Thunderball, the 4th Connery Bond film. And then the last Wednesday in June will be another one of these Silver Age. For all of 2021, I'm doing the last Wednesday in the month, a spotlight on one of the Silver Age artists that are in my book. Mm-hmm. So starting in January, I did Carmen Infantino, then I did Kurt Swan, then I did Jack Kirby, then I did Joe Kubert. Tomorrow night, I'm doing Steve Ditko and John Romita and their versions of Spider-Man. And what I'm going to do at the end of June, I'm really not sure yet. I haven't decided. I'll probably do maybe Gil Kane, maybe John Buscema, maybe Gene Colan. These are some of the great artists from that era. And my free webinars, I do not with New York Adventure Club. I do on my own. And if you just go to my website, arlenschumer.com, there's an events tab where I post all of my events and webinars and various comings and goings. So you can always go there, or Facebook me. I'm always posting everything on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Tumblr. I'm on Twitter, whatever. And no pseudonyms. It's Arlen Schumer or whatever. So, it's not hard to find what I'm doing and where I'm being. But nyadventureclub.com and arlenschumer.com, that's all you'll need.
Well, I want to thank you for spending the time. And like I said, you're welcome back anytime. And
anytime you want me, Chad, let me know, because, I'm an eager beaver to share the things that I love.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming on. And
thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to the webinar tonight about the Max Fleischer Superman. And I'll be in touch, and stay healthy, stay safe.
You got to come to my Ditko Romita thing tomorrow night.
I will try to.
6:00. And again, if you can't make these things live with New York Adventure Club, if you buy a ticket, you can watch a recording of the webinar for up to a week.
Yep.
With my free webinars, I just post them a week or two later on my YouTube or Vimeo channels, and those because they're for free, so anybody can see them later. So thanks for having me on, Chad.
All right. Well, thank you, and I'll let you get off and prepare for this evening.
You got it. Take care.
All right. Later.